Okay, this is the review, the YouTube review for Unit 2, which is Measurements of Economic Performance. First topic here is Gross Domestic Product, GDP. This is a way to measure the health of an economy based on the money value of all the output in an economy. So you take a market basket, a basket of all the goods created in an economy in a given year. So you should write that down. In a given year within the country's own boundaries or borders. You should write that down too. It's a specific time frame of a year, and it has to be production that occurs within the boundaries or borders of a nation. And it is a monetary value, so it's the money value of all the goods in that basket. And we are talking about final goods that are being counted. There are some key terms to keep in mind when thinking about GDP. One is aggregate output, so we referred back to that in the last slide, all the output that is produced in a given year. It includes final goods, not intermediate goods. So an example and definition of an intermediate good is a good before it's used in the final product, so a gas pedal. We do not count the production of a gas pedal created at a side factory, which is then sold to Toyota. We don't count that because the value of that gas pedal will already be counted in the value of the finished product, the car. So GDP does not count intermediate goods. It does count final goods, and that is to avoid double counting. So final good is a good that is ready for consumption. And you purchase these things with your disposable income. So you should write the definition. Personal income is all your wages, but disposable income is your income minus taxes. So it's what you have left after taxes are taken out of your income. You do want to write these two additional facts about disposable income, or DI. You can do one of two things with it. You can either spend it or you can save it, and that's it. So you can either spend or save. The second fact that you want to put down is that disposable income, DI, is the strongest determinant of consumption. So later we'll talk about GDP being C plus IG plus G plus XN. Well, disposable income is the number one determinant or influence in C consumption. That's going to be a really big point later on in the course, so better to know that now. Some other exceptions in GDP before we get to the equation, things that are not included. So get a list down of things that are excluded from GDP counting. And the first would be financial transactions. So this is when money is given to someone, but not in return for a good or service. So the money value, it's not really important to GDP because nothing new was produced. So examples, you would write down examples: Social Security, welfare, veterans pay. They're getting money, but not for a good or service that they've contributed. Private gifts or transfers like stock exchange, those are excluded. Another thing that is excluded are resales or second-hand sales. So used cars, anything that's used. It wasn't produced in that year, so it doesn't count. So there's a quick review of things that are included and excluded. This equation here is called the expenditures approach of measuring GDP. Expenditures because we're talking about adding up all the money that people spent as opposed to income received. So I would like you to write that down about expenditures approach, that it's C plus IG plus G plus XN. That is the expenditures approach. And write down the definition, that is the total money spent on goods or services. So as opposed to income that is received. We're looking at it from the spender's standpoint. So let's talk about what the different components are. So you need to write these things down. The C is personal consumption. So these are on goods and services. The IG is referring to investment. These would be things like the purchasing of capital goods, tools that are going to be used by businesses. Construction like warehouses and residential homes. So remember, that's sort of one of the tricky ones. If a person builds a house in a year, that is considered IG, investment. Inventories, change in inventories, I mean. So if you have a building that, like you stockpile goods that are not sold, that's your inventory. Well, each year you calculate what was added to that stockpile, and that addition of inventory goes under IG. If you had sold that inventory in that year, that would become part of consumption. So if I make, I don't know, let's say shoes, and I make 100 pairs of shoes, if I sell them all at $1 a piece, which is ridiculous, that'd be $100 in my GDP under consumption. If, however, I only sell 50 of them become part of consumption. The other 50 are still counted in GDP, but they fall under the category of IG because they are in inventory. Another example, I'm looking at a PowerPoint here to make sure that I've covered everything you need to know. Okay, let's move on to G. Easy one, government purchases. So anything that the government spends money on in terms of a good or service. Military, defense, highways, schools, etc. That's all part of G. And then XN stands for net exports. So you just take your exports minus your imports. Obviously, if you have a trade deficit where you import more, then that means XN would be negative. So, of course, it's bringing the value of your GDP down. Okay. Also something that I want you to write down, very important, consumption, C, out of that equation, consumption is the biggest determinant of GDP. So if there are changes in any of those, the changes in consumption spending percentage-wise will influence GDP the most. So that is very important to know that C goes first because it is the most influential. Let's talk about economic growth and nominal growth and real growth. So I'd like you to get down the definition for economic growth. That, by definition, is increased output. And this is a rightward shift of the PPC. I want you to write those two things down, that it's increased output and that it's a rightward shift of the PPC. That is economic growth, when you produce more stuff in an economy. So then you have your nominal versus your real GDP. So let's talk about what that means just in words, and then we'll write down some equations. Nominal GDP is the economic growth in name. It's the raw data. This is how these are how many goods are sold at what prices, and we get all the prices together. So in name, it's the raw data. Real GDP is your nominal GDP adjusted for inflation. So earlier in the course, we looked at two market baskets, and we saw that the same amount of products were produced each year, but the value of the basket went up. Well, we didn't produce any more goods. It would be deceiving to look at just the two GDP numbers, and we'd say, oh, look how much economic growth we've had. But really, it's just the price levels that increase. So real GDP, by definition, is GDP adjusted for inflation. Let's start talking about the equations. First, you have the price index. So how you get the price index is you add up all the value of the market basket of a current year, and you divide it by the market basket of a base year. So usually the AP test will give you like all this data on a couple of different types of goods, the prices from different years, and then the amount consumed. So you would have to multiply the price and quantity of a good and then add them all together to get your market basket. And then you would take that value divided by the base year. Well, the AP test will choose what your base year is. So the price index of the base year, looking at this slide, is always going to be 1. If you take the price index and multiply it by 100, then you're going to always have a base year of 100. So base year, you're either going to have as 1 or 100. Before we talk about percentage change or the inflation rate, I cannot stress enough how important it is to do practice problems. So go back to the workbook problems we did, practice AP questions that you've done. That is the best way to study for this. You can sit there and study these equations for hours, but it'll be much more efficient if you just use them over and over so that they become second nature to you. Once you have the price index, you then want to look at the percentage change in prices, or what we call the inflation rate. So all you do is you take the difference between the two price indices. So if you have base year of 100 and the following year it's 150, you take the change. 150 minus 100 is 50. And then you take it over the base index, which would be 100. So there's a 50% change. If they give you 2 years to compare that are not the base years, then you might have the base index number in the denominator there be a different number than 100. So then you have to actually carry out the math to find out what the percentage is. Then you have your real GDP. So to find out really what our economic growth is, you take your nominal and you divide it by the price index. Real quickly, want to point out, economists sometimes want to find out, okay, here's your economic growth, but how many people do you have in your country? And per person, per capita, meaning per person, per head, what kind of growth is that really? If you have billions of people in your population, your economic growth per person is not as great as if you had the same growth but only 1 million people to divide it up between. So per capita, you would take your real GDP and just divide it by the population to find out how much economic growth there was per person in your country. This then moves us to the second chapter of Unit 2, which would be Unemployment and Inflation, chapter number 7. So feel free in the last chapter, chapter 6, or in this chapter, chapter 7, to refer to your book if you have lingering questions that you forget to ask me. So we're going to be talking about unemployment, and first let's start with the labor force. So you want to get down a definition of who is a part of the labor force. Well, that would be anyone looking for a job of age. So in the United States, minors do not count. Internationally, typically minors do not count. I'm saying minors, M-A-M-I-N-O-R-S, not E-R-S, not someone going in a coal mine, but youngsters. They do not count. You also don't count if you're in a correctional institution, mental institution, etc. So they would not count. In terms of unemployment, you want to get this down. These are the number of people unemployed who are looking for a job. That is the key point. Unemployed who are looking for a job. So if you're unemployed but you're not looking for a job, you are not counted in unemployment rate. The equation then for unemployment would be the number of unemployed divided by the labor pool. Make a note that part-time workers are considered employed. So part-time workers are considered employed. Let's look at the 3 types of unemployment. The first is frictional. This is when you're between jobs. So it's voluntary. Those are words to get down. Between jobs, voluntary, or you're going to be hired soon. So it's inevitable. It's going to be part of society. And you want to write this down. It's also desirable. It indicates mobility of a labor force. You can move between jobs. An example of this would be seasonal jobs. So lifeguards would be an example of this. Or someone that's moving cities and is going to get a job when they move to their new home. Second type is structural. These result from changes in consumer demand and technology that alter the structure of the labor. So when things happen in an economy and it changes the structure of the skills needed. So words that get down are skills are outdated. Shoemaking became an outdated skill when they start using factories. So those people had to learn new skills to get jobs, which they could do. They weren't being denied jobs because there were no jobs in the economy available, just none that suited their skills at that point. Okay, then you have cyclical. Frictional and structural do not worry economists. So you need to indicate that. Maybe put an arrow by the 2. Do not worry economists. Cyclical does. This is what you want to get down as a definition. Cyclical unemployment caused by a decrease in consumer spending, which marks a recession. A recession, when there's a decrease in consumer spending, so the economy slows, less production, less workers. So if demand for goods fall in a society as a whole, that could be a real problem because it perpetuates itself. less people want to buy clothes. So factories stop producing so many. So then they lay off some workers. Now there are more people in society without jobs who can't buy clothes and other goods. And it's just this downward spiraling cycle. Cyclical is the type of unemployment that marks a recession. And you should note that and write it on your packet. Let's talk about the term full employment. It can be a little deceiving. You want to write down the definition. This is when there is only frictional and structural unemployment. So full employment means there is unemployment. Full employment means that there is unemployment, but it's only frictional or structural. And make sure I say that correctly. So another way of defining it, the second way you should write down is full employment equals no cyclical unemployment. So you can have people out of jobs, but still be at full employment of your resources. Write this down or even mark the graph and label it. This would be any point on the PPC. Okay, synonymous with this, natural rate of unemployment. So you can either say full employment or natural rate of unemployment, and they mean the same thing, NRU. So that would mean the number of job seekers equal the number of jobs that are available. You can have 6% NRU. Natural rate of unemployment does not mean 0%. That's not perfection. We assume that frictional and structural unemployment are normal and even sometimes healthy for an economy. Let's shift our focus to the last topic here, and that would be inflation, really. CPI, I could have put with the other slide under price index. The consumer price index, write that definition down, consumer price index, CPI, is just another price index measuring inflation. However, with the C, consumption, it is focusing only on goods that consumers buy. So you're not including government purchases, etc., but the price levels of consumer goods and services. You want to get that down. But let's define inflation. So by definition, write this down. General level of prices rise. Second thing you need to write down after you say that it's a general rise or a rise in the general level of prices is that each dollar buys fewer goods. So this means that inflation reduces the purchasing power of money. It reduces the amount money can buy you. So write that. Each dollar buys fewer goods and services than before, and inflation reduces the purchasing power of money. You can buy less with that dollar that you could have acquired before. I say rise in the general level of prices because we're talking about aggregate as a society as a whole. So jean prices may go down, but when you average every type of good or service that's sold, price levels have gone up. Besides defining it, we know that we measure it through a price index or the CPI, but let's talk about the graph of it. Okay, so here's the graph. You want to draw this and label it. X-axis quantity, Y-axis price level, but you also want to write interest rate. Someone asked, well, what interest rate? We're just saying, in general, on average, interest rates average together. So we'll get more specific on types of interest rates later, but they just mean generally, what is the price of money. Okay, so aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Just like supply and demand, but we say aggregate because it's not supply and demand for jeans or one good, but all goods in society. Notice that AD, aggregate demand, equals GDP. It's all the demand for consumption goods, investment, government purchases, and exports. The intersection, the red lines, would be quantity one and price one at equilibrium. There are different things that could cause inflation. We know inflation would mean that the price level would have to increase. So look on the graph. P1 is less than P2. P2, price level has gone up, that's inflation. So this is graphing inflation. You want to draw a shift. So to AD2, the second AD curve, price levels and quantity have gone up. So what's good is that more people are probably employed if you're making more output, even though price levels are higher. Can't make a judgment call if this graph means it's good or bad for society. It all depends. So we'll have a conversation about both. I would like you to write under the graph that in this case, it was demand pull inflation, P-U-L-L. Obviously, because demand pulled the price levels up. We could have inflation where supply would have moved to the left. So kind of visualize that. Pause it if you have to, but visualize supply decreasing. So it shifts to the left. I don't think that I said it went up before. So if I did, scratch that. If aggregate supply decreases or shifts to the left, that causes the price level to increase. So that would be cost push inflation, meaning that the cost, the supply of the goods is what caused price levels to go up. Let's look at how inflation affects interest rates and income. So we have income, it's the money you make. You can calculate the percentage change in your real income by taking the nominal income change percentage and subtracting it from the inflation rate. This sounds more complicated the way I'm saying it than it actually is. It's easier to just see it in math format, so look at some of our practice problems. But write down this example. If your nominal income changes 5%, but inflation rate goes up 7%, your real income percentage change is -2. You take your nominal 5 and your inflation rate, so 5 minus the 7 equals -2. If your income change was 2% and inflation was only 1%, 2 minus 1 is 1. You have a 1% change in real income. Real income meaning the actual power of your income, taking your nominal and adjusting it for inflation. They could give you the raw data, which I've never seen them do on the AP test. Real income, so you just put in the data. Real income would be X equals nominal, so the amount on your W-2 divided by the price index. Same with interest rates. You can look at the percentage change in real interest rates when you take the nominal minus the inflation rate. So you do that the exact same way you would adjust for income. So let's look at who benefits or who's hurt by unanticipated inflation. Inflation you don't see coming. Helped or unaffected. Flexible income receivers. Flexible income means your income will change. So if it's not fixed, if it's flexible, then you can adjust your income based on inflation. So you can either be helped if your income change is better than the inflation rate, or you could be unaffected, that your income may move with inflation. I know, like in teachers' contracts, we might have a 3% increase in wages each year because we average or assume that inflation will also go up about 3%. Those are sort of our best guesses. Who is hurt? Debtors. You write that down, debtors, or borrowers, people that borrow money. If I borrow $1,000 at 2% interest, and then I owe $200, that amount is worth less when I pay it back. So the real interest rate was actually less than 2%. If inflation is anticipated instead of unanticipated, then people can sort of adjust their income or interest rate levels to try to offset the inflation. Who's hurt? If it's unanticipated, fixed income receivers. They're always going to get the same amount of income. Then with each year, that fixed amount is worth less and less. Savers are hurt. If you save at an interest rate of 2%, well, that money, that 2%, $200 that you earned, really isn't worth what it was previously. Creditors are also hurt. If you loan money out at 2%, but inflation occurs, so it's like you're only getting a 1% return rate, then you are also hurt or negatively affected by inflation. Again, if it's anticipated, people can adjust. If Randy wants to charge a 3% interest rate, but he knows inflation is going to go up 2%, he's going to, that's right, charge 5% interest rate. Two quick terms here. Deflation, that's the opposite of inflation. So instead of price levels going up, price levels, hopefully you got that right and said, go down. If you say that inflation increases, that's like saying deflation decrease. So that's a weird way of saying that. If inflation is negative, it's actually deflation. So if you have -7 inflation, that means it actually deflated. It went down by 7%. I would write that down. And I would also write down if the price index is less than 1, you actually have deflation. So price levels went down. And you can plug in the math and see how that would influence if you took a CPI divided by the price index and the denominator is less than 1, then your real GDP is actually going to be greater than your nominal. So if you have deflation, your price levels go down, then your real rate of change is even greater than the nominal value is indicating. Either way, price index, whether it's inflation or deflation, will more accurately tell you what your economic growth was. Real quickly, hyperinflation. Hyper, it happens really fast, totally unexpected. People's wages, write this down, people's wages do not have time to catch up. So that means that price levels are skyrocketing and you don't have time for your wages to adjust. So this is really bad for society and sort of stalls or stops consumer spending. That does it for this unit review. Do your practice AP questions, practice problems, and have fun studying.